With dreams of becoming a successful writer and finding love, like in a Jane Austen novel, Agathe is a hopelessly clumsy, yet charming young woman working at the legendary Shakespeare & Co. bookshop in Paris. When her best friend lands her a spot at the Jane Austen Writers' Residency in England, everything changes. Will she finally get her Jane Austen moment? Critics call Jane Austen Wrecked My Life a delectable modern rom-com and brimming with charm. Watch it home on digital today. Rated R.
Welcome to The Thing About Austen, a podcast about Jane Austen's world. I'm Zan.
And I'm Diane. And this episode, we're talking about Manydown Park. We are so excited to welcome both of our guests for this episode. Our first with two guests, so it's very, very exciting. So first up, we have Sarah Rose Kearns, who goes by Rose. Rose is a playwright, performer, and lifelong Austen enthusiast. Her stage adaptation of Persuasion debuted off-Broadway in 2021, while her one-act play, Manydown, has been performed in 5 U.S. states, as well as in the U.K. and New Zealand. She is currently working with filmmaker Prerna Ramachandra on a screen adaptation of Manydown. She is also preparing for the first public reading of The Austens, her latest play, at Chawton House this summer, and for the second full production of Persuasion at Baltimore's Chesapeake Shakespeare Company in September and October. Welcome, Rose!
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And I get the honor of introducing our second guest. This is Prerna Ramachandra, and she is an award-winning writer and filmmaker based in New York City. She has written, directed, and produced 5 short films exploring themes of mental health, grief, generational trauma, and identity. She's a lover of Jane Austen, romance and mystery novels, and the films of Greta Gerwig and Sarah Polley. Her work subverts long-beloved tropes in genre films, pushing the envelope of what a happy ending is, and who gets to experience it. Her films have been screened both in the U.S. and internationally, including at the Big Apple Film Festival in New York, the Chicago South Asian Film Festival, and the River to River Florence International Indian Film Festival. She's currently working on the film adaptation of Manydown. Welcome, Prerna.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are thrilled to have you both here. So to set up this episode, we don't have our usual scene setting since this is one of our Austen biographical episodes, so no quote for the listeners this week. Instead, we're going to dive right into this discussion of Austen's one known proposal of marriage from Harris Bigg-Wither in December 1802. To get us started, can one of you tell us about the Bigg-Wither family, their standing in the community, sort of who are the players that we're working with here?
Yeah, great question. So the Bigg-Wither family were friends of the Austens. They lived at Manydown Park, which was about 2.5 miles from Steventon. So Jane Austen and Cassandra grew up spending time with Harris Bigg-Wither's sisters. The Bigg-Wither family moved to the neighborhood in 1789. Lovelace Bigg-Wither, Harris's father, then called Lovelace Bigg.
What a name.
I know, right? He inherited Manydown Park from a childless cousin in 1789, and so he had to, as part of the condition of the inheritance, had to change his name and his son's names to hyphenated Bigg-Wither. In her letters, Jane actually refers to him as Mr. Wither. That seems to be what he used socially. But his daughters all retained the surname Bigg. So we've got the Bigg-Withers officially. Men are referred to as Wither. Girls are referred to as Bigg.
Not confusing at all.
Not confusing at all. So when Lovelace brought his family into Jane Austen's neighborhood in 1789, he was a widower with 8 children. He had 2 sons and 6 daughters. One of the sons died as a teenager, so Harris was the younger, but he is the one who ended up inheriting. 6 older sisters. Can imagine what that must have been like for him. The 3 youngest of the Bigg sisters seem to have been the ones that were closest to Jane and Cassandra, certainly closest in age, and they married later, so they would have had more time to spend with them. But those three sisters were Elizabeth, Catherine, and Alethea. Elizabeth married William Heathcote in 1790s at some point, and so she had left home by the time this incident took place in 1802, but she had just earlier that year moved back because her husband died and she was left without a lot of money and a baby son, so she was living with her single younger sisters and her widowed father. And so those were the people who were on site for this incident. Jane and Cassandra were invited to stay with the big sisters in, I think they arrived late November 1802, and about a week after that, Harris proposed to Jane.
Okay. So now we've got the players. Now let's move to, the scene, the setting. So
Yeah.
So could you tell us, what was Manydown Park like as a residence?
Well, it was built sometime in the 1400s, probably. It seems that the Wither family, the childless branch that Lovelace inherited from, had lived in that spot from the Middle Ages. We don't know, or at least I haven't been able to find out a lot of information about what it was like. There are a couple of images of it that survive. It seems to have had 3 stories. We know it had a ballroom. The ballroom at Manydown is actually mentioned in Jane Austen's earliest surviving letters as one of the places she was flirting with Tom Lefroy. But it appears to be a sort of medieval-style house with, what Emma calls the old neglect of prospect. It's sitting lower in the ground than more modern houses would have done that were built in Austen's time.
Do we have a kind of a sense of their financial standing in the neighborhood? Like, were they sort of the prominent family of the area, or,
Yeah, they were one of them. They don't seem to have been fabulously wealthy, but they did own 2 estates. So, Jane Austen's family were not technically members of the landed gentry. Their father was a clergyman, and they didn't own any estates. So this, suggests that they had a sort of higher socioeconomic status, more lavish lifestyle than the Austens, at least. When Harris did eventually marry a couple years after this incident with Jane, his marriage settlements secured a lot. There was a sum of £10,000 to be divided between any daughters that were born. So that's, depends on how big the family is, how much each of the girls gets. As it turned out, he had 5 sons and 5 daughters. So they each got £2,000 to marry on, which is not a lot in a Jane Austen novel. Catherine Morland has £3,000, and her father doesn't even have an estate. He's a clergyman too. And they did, both Harris's generation and the subsequent generation had a lot of children. They did run into financial difficulties later in the 19th century and actually sold the estates and all the property that had been purchased around the turn of the 19th century to another family in 1871 for about £100,000.
So they were definitely more wealthy and prominent than the Austens, but we're not talking about a Mr. Darcy, not a proposal from a Mr. Darcy with a Pemberley kind of a situation.
That's right. I think maybe more like a proposal from a Mr. Collins who has Longbourn took forward to.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so Harris proposed to Jane Austen on this night in December 1802. She accepted him. His family seems to have been pleased. And the next day, Jane Austen got up and said, "Oh, never mind, I'm so sorry." Jane and Cassandra left in a hurry. They insisted that the coach drive them to Steventon, where, of course, their brother James was rector, and that he would take them home to Bath, where they were living with their parents at the time.
And all this information that we have about the proposal, this is coming to us secondhand, correct?
That's right. We have a record of it from Caroline Austen, James's daughter, who seems to have heard about it from her mother, Mary Lloyd Austen. We also, I think this might be the first time it was mentioned publicly. In 1882, Fanny Catherine Lefroy, who was the daughter of James's daughter Anna, published a sort of defense of Jane Austen against the people who say that she had no love in her life.
Ah, okay.
In 1882. And Fanny claims that, there's this apocryphal story about the seaside lover in Sidmouth who died. That is said to have happened in early 1802. So Fanny attributes her rejection of Harris Bigg-Wither to that she was still in love with this guy who died.
Yeah, it is interesting how so much of this is coming to us like secondhand and sort of many years later.
Right.
Unfortunately, we don't have some great diarrhea of Jane Austen's where she's like pouring out her feelings on the evening of, right?
Wouldn't that be nice? No, we don't. Most of what we know about, or most of what I know about the Bigg-Wither family comes from a book that was written in 1907 by Reginald Bigg-Wither, who was Harris's grandson. It's called Materials for a History of the Wither Family. He talks about the financial transactions and so forth, the people's birth and death dates. He calls it Materials for a History rather than a history because he acknowledges that it's sort of sketchy, but did what research he could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I love that, what you have described, what we do know, again, through these secondhand accounts, really does emphasize that the moment after the rejection, that it's like an immediate, like, oh, okay, I'm so sorry, but we have to go. Like the social interactions become incredibly stilted, perhaps, afterwards, which makes so much sense, but just it's also a really big thing.
Well, and that's something that I mentioned in the play, this sort of, there's this concern that Jane and Cassandra will lose their relationship with the big sisters, which in fact they did not. They managed to continue to be friends, which is lovely. But I think there was a lot of embarrassment around this issue. And in fact, it's not mentioned in James Edward Austen Leigh's biography of his aunt. And in this text that I just mentioned, the history of the Bigg-Wither family, the author sort of brags that his ancestors knew Jane Austen and quotes from her letters, but also does not mention this incident at all. So even as late as 1907, it was embarrassing.
I mean, it makes sense though, like this, without being prurient about what happened. I just the facts of it, accepting a proposal and then having what undoubtedly would have been some sort of agonizing evening for Austen to have that reversal. I think without speculating, just knowing that those events happened, those social interactions become really tested. Yeah.
I think the fact that they almost immediately send away, right, for conveyance home is somewhat telling as well.
Yes. Mary Lloyd Austen, who, of course, Jane didn't get on particularly well with, seems to have been annoyed that they insisted on being driven by James back to Bath, even though it was a Sunday. And he was busy, of course, because he was a clergyman.
But it makes sense that they would want to distance themselves physically from this social awkwardness.
Yeah, and then one of the nieces recorded a memory, I think, of the women sort of weeping on the doorstep as the big sisters dropped Jane and Cassandra off. Yeah.
Big moment. Yeah, I think the idea that this is kind of a watershed moment, regardless of, again, without the prurient speculation about, women need a man in their lives. But just, this was a big life decision that she made.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I became increasingly aware of as I started doing research for this project. Of course, Jane was 2 weeks shy of her 27th birthday when this incident happened. And although there were lots of women in real life who married after the age of 27, that seems to be sort of the threshold of spinsterhood in her work. Right? We have Charlotte Lucas, Anne Elliot, and Marianne's hypothetical lady who could never feel or receive affection again. So Jane Austen had it in her head that 27 was the cutoff. And I do think the interpretation that I have favored in my imagining of this incident is that it was a decision not to marry at all and instead to be a writer. And of course, I didn't put together this timeline until I started researching for this project, but Susan was sold to the publisher Benjamin Crosby in the spring of 1803. As we know from the Mrs. Ashton Dennis letter. So it seems quite plausible to me that she decided that she was going to pursue publication. At the same time, she decided not to marry Harris.
Yeah. I think that there would be support for that logic. Absolutely. Yeah.
I also think that to me, that the moment of her rejecting the proposal and deciding to pursue writing full time, it was a point where she was making an incredibly large sacrifice, not just for herself, but also for her family. Because this marriage, or any marriage with a man like Harris Bigg-Wither, would have set her up and her sister up financially for the rest of their lives. I mean, it is a choice that, all of her heroines have to make in their novels. And much as I agree that we, don't want to define Jane Austen by who she loved or who she could have married or not, it is a very primary theme in her novels, not because she thinks that women need men, but because that was the primary way in which women of her social class were able to have some sort of a comfortable financial life. So this decision that she made at 27, which I feel is still incredibly young when you think about, her life in the grand scheme of things, was a huge sacrifice, and not just for her, but for her family. And so the fact that she likely had Cassandra's support in making this decision also meant that Cassandra was making a sacrifice on her part, because she very well knew she was also giving up financial security for herself that she would probably never get otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing to think about, right? Within the context of the time, that it's more than just like, oh, let's talk about all of Jane Austen's possible boyfriends, like it's much more than that. It's really about there is a significant social and financial significance to a decision like this when, your options and your choices are quite limited.
Absolutely. Well, at this point, they had been living in Bath for about almost 2 years after their father, George Austen, had retired and made over Steventon Rectory to his son, James. But there was no inheritance at all for Jane. And Cassandra had £1,000 that she'd been willed by Tom Fowle, her fiancé that died. But that, that's not enough to support two women in a genteel lifestyle at that time, not even close. So I think there was, even at the moment that she was making this decision, there was a real question of what is going to happen to us after our parents die. As long as Dad's alive, we've got some income that he's reserved for himself out of the Steventon Rectory. But after that, we'll be presumably parceled off to the other brothers, maybe separated. I mean, there was a lot to be afraid of, as Jane Austen knew quite well. She shows a sensitivity, even in her earliest letters, I think, to the plight of single women and the lack of control they have over their own fortunes.
Yeah, and just kind of piggybacking off of that, I also feel like the fact that, as far as we know, she didn't seem to get a ton of family pressure to go through with this engagement at the point that she wanted to break it off from her father, from her mother, maybe some from her sister-in-law, Mary, but we don't really know. But the most important people in her family to her were very supportive, somewhat supportive of this decision, and didn't feel like they were trying to push her or force her towards this marriage, is incredibly telling of the sort of relationship the Austen parents had with their children. And the environment that Jane probably grew up in that likely also allowed her to explore and thrive as a writer and kind of have these dreams. And that, I think, is very groundbreaking for the time if you think about sort of the social mores and the fact that their own social standing as a family could be called into question by the decision that she made.
I mean, it's very different. Like, if you have to think about it, again, perhaps not a Darcy of Pemberley situation, but if it's a Collins of Longbourn, that's not an insignificant estate, right? That is a very good income to support a family. And you think about, Charlotte and the choice that she makes, which I think Austen writes with, I've always felt she writes like with an understanding, right? Like perhaps Lizzie doesn't get it, but it does feel like Austen kind of gets like the choices that Charlotte.
Absolutely. Yes.
And you can also really see, right, the way that Lady Lucas is just like, and now I will tell everybody within a whatever mile radius, because this is the biggest, best thing that could have possibly happened to us. And so for Jane to reject a similar situation and to have seemingly had the support of her family.
Yeah. It must have been very frightening, but she'd been writing these wonderful stories since she was about 12, right? She was at this point 26, had been a writer more than half her life. And certainly, I think most of us can agree, her juvenilia is publishable. It's incredible, the quality that she was able to produce at a young age. And while there were married women who were published authors at the time, I think it was unusual, and probably would have been particularly unusual in somebody who was the mistress of an estate. And, if she'd had the life of Harris's eventual wife, Anne Howfirth, the mother of 10 children. Yeah. It's difficult to imagine somebody writing with the artistry and care that Jane Austen so clearly lavished on her work, while having all those other social responsibilities, plus the stigma.
Yeah, I don't think the question necessarily, people might sometimes ask, if she had married Harris, would we never have seen her write again? And I don't know if it's necessarily that extreme, As Rose said, there are women who are married who are writing, but I don't think we would have seen the kind of quality of work that we have seen. I don't know if Jane Austen would be the Jane Austen we knew. I think she would have been another writer of the time who was quite popular, whose books kind of get lost to the ethers of history, because she would have gone from that very supportive family environment that we just described to having roles and responsibilities as a mistress of the house and having to get the permission of other people in her life, including her husband, to be able to write and publish books.
That's right. And now that I think of it, the other women writers I know who did marry were at least Frances Burney and Sydney Owenson were both published authors before they married. So their husbands knew what they were getting into. Making that transition afterwards might have been more difficult.
Well, I think even the fact that we know, right, that once they did set up their, after her father passed away and, eventually they set up that household in Chawton, that it was very much sort of created, right, to give Austen the space to write, and that the other women were kind of, not that she didn't have her own responsibilities and duties, famously in charge of the tea and the wine, like the important things, but and making breakfast. But that, it seemed like the other women were really kind of like running the show, right, from like a sort of housekeeping perspective.
Right. Well, even I think as early as like the 1790s, Mrs. Austen declared she was retired and passed off her household thanks to Cassandra.
She's done. She's planting potatoes in the garden. She's busy,
Right. Yeah. She does the stuff she enjoys, but she's not the manager. But of course, we know Martha Lloyd took a lot of responsibility for the cookery, or at least instructing the cooks, planning the recipes and so forth. And I think it seems that Cassandra did the rest. So yes, basically she had two housewives that she could rely on. She didn't have to be one.
Yeah. It's such a perhaps cliched line, but from Virginia Woolf, to have a room of one's own, the fact that that was essential, I think, an essential ingredient of what gives us the Austen we have today, and that's not a guarantee.
Absolutely, and the fact that Jane Austen as a writer she's so clearly not writing to the marketplace. We have a lot of internal evidence from her letters that she wanted people to like her books. She cared what people thought, but her attention to detail is so much greater than it needed to be to sell books. If that was her objective, she would have written something different. Yeah. She was not in a position where she had to rely on her pen to make money. And so she was able to create these stunning works of art. And of course, she's very realistic about money in her letters, and I don't mean to romanticize her, but her work is so startlingly different from what other writers were doing in her, in the first decades of the 19th century. And it seems to me, my interpretation is that she was consciously making a decision to pursue her own vision and voice rather than just writing things that she thought other people would like.
I think that's a fair assessment. I think that's fairly accurate. Well, before we wrap up, we would love to hear from both of you on how you're going about adapting this piece of Austen's biography for the screen. So where are you starting and where do you hope to end? Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah. So I had the pleasure of assistant directing a staged version, a staged reading of Rose's play a couple of years ago, and I absolutely fell in love with the story. As a huge Jane Austen fan myself, I was aware of this incident, but I didn't know any of the lore around it or any of the great research that Rose has done. And I really wanted to tell the story in a different format that would help it reach a larger audience. Because I do think that this is something that is not just important for the Austen fandom because it is about the one incident we know where Jane was engaged to somebody, and we know something about her love life. As we just talked, it also, I think, a pivotal moment in Jane's life where she decides to dedicate her life to being an artist and a writer. And it's the moment that essentially gave us all the books that we have today. And so I think it's incredibly important, and I think it's incredibly relevant to the time frame that we're living in right now. I think artists since time immemorial have had to make choices between, do I do something to earn money and have a comfortable life, or do I dedicate myself to creating art that is long-lasting and meaningful but may not provide me financial stability? And so these are the themes that I really wanted to bring out and explore in this film adaptation. A lot of what has been done in the stage adaptation And then the second piece to this is much has been said about Jane's relationship with Cassandra. I personally believe that even though she never married us, or as far as we know, never had a lover, her closest relationship and her soulmate was her sister. I don't think Jane would have been the writer we know if it had not been for Cassandra's support. Indeed, the entire family support, but specifically we know how close she was to her sister and what a big cheerleader Cassandra was to her. And so I wanted to bring out that sister relationship because I don't think it's explored very well in popular media. I think sisterhood and sister relationships are over-dramatized, or where sisters are fighting over a man or some such situation, and the complexities of those relationships are not necessarily explored in a way with nuance and subtlety that I think is really, really important. As a filmmaker, I'm also incredibly excited to see what we can do with a visual medium where we can really bring out the closeness of the sisters within the space of this home, because they are in Manydown when they're making this decision. So you can actually see very clearly and visually what Jane would be turning down if she says no. And like, it reminds me of all those adaptations of Pride and Prejudice where we see Pemberley for the first time and Lizzie says, of all this, I could have been mistress. It's really something to see it in front of your eyes, especially after seeing how they've lived before. And so I think kind of really seeing that visually hits home to anybody watching this, like what kind of a choice Jane had to make. And so I'm really interested in bringing those elements out at a time when I think more than ever, we are having to make the kinds of choices we're having to make as artists as to like how to pursue the art we want to pursue. And then the last thing I'll say, and I'd love to have Rose say something about this too, is Rose mentioned, Jane did want to be, we know she wanted to be famous. We know she wanted to be a published writer. But at the same time, she had to dedicate her life to bringing out this art that may or may not have sold. And I think there's this constant tension that we don't see enough portrayed whenever we see popular culture portray Jane Austen, where she wants to be a known figure and she wants to be well-liked, but she also wants to make choices that feel right to her as an artist and follow her own artistic moral compass. And that extends to the decisions she has to make when she decides to say no to a very eligible proposal. Like, she wants to be liked by these people. We know she and Harris have known each other since they were children, probably because she's close to his sisters. So having to make that really complex choice and figuring out, like, do I want to be liked or do I follow what feels right to me and follow my heart, for lack of a better term? I think it's an incredibly complex choice to make. And I want to be able to bring that out and just for our viewers to see her as a complex human being and not just someone who is perfect or who has too many flaws. Like, she is a human being and she's making these choices. She was making these choices every day as she decided to dedicate her life to writing. So that's what we want to explore in this film.
And that's right. Absolutely. I'll just add, so I wrote Manydown the play a few years ago. Prerna asked me if she could adapt it as a screenplay, and I was delighted. I love what she's done with it. The piece that I've been working on most recently, my new play, is called The Austens, and it is a full-length piece about Jane Austen and her family. It takes some of these themes and moves them to the next, what I am envisioning as kind of the next creative crisis in Jane Austen's life in 1810, the year before Sense and Sensibility came out. Because, of course, we know that despite her gathering her courage and deciding to dedicate her life to her writing, she did manage to sell Susan, what we know as Northanger Abbey, to a publisher, but it never came out. And so in the subsequent play, she's going through some of these same things. I mean, she's got a little bit of perspective, but she's also been really crushed by this disappointment and has to find the courage to try again. And I do think that it seems very clear that the support of her family and friends, specifically Cassandra and Martha, was crucial to that.
So where are you at in the production process? Like, when do you start filming? How are you guys going about making this film happen?
Yeah, so we are kicking off a crowdfunding campaign this summer. If you follow us on our socials, you will be able to find information about that. And if you're able to support us, we would absolutely love that. We're completely bootstrapping this project. It's an independent film, and we're really committed to making sure we pay our actors and our cast and our crew and everybody involved a fair wage. And so, we will be kicking off that crowdfunding campaign. Our hope is to be able to film it at some point at the end of the summer, early fall. And if you do end up supporting our Kickstarter campaign, we would love to have an early screening on December 2nd, which is the day that the engagement took place, for anybody who is support the campaign. So that is our goal, is to be able to have an early screening for this on December 2nd and finish the short film by then. And ideally, have a wider release at some point next year.
That's great.
I do love that you're releasing it on that date. I do love it.
Perfect timing.
I'm trying to get this going as a holiday for J
There you
Nights.
go.
Actually, when we had the gala with the reading that Prerna assistant directed in 2023, it was on that day as well. Trying to mark it.
I love it.
Well, Rose, Prerna, thank you both for coming on and talking to us about both this moment in Jane Austen's biography and also the upcoming film. Very excited about that. Where can our listeners find both of you online? Follow along with this project.
I'm on Instagram. It's just my first name, last name, Prerna.Ramachandra. And I would also let Rose give her Instagram, but this is being produced under her theater company's umbrella, which is a nonprofit. They do great work in New York City, and it's called the Holy Theater. And yeah, you should find them on socials and follow them as well.
That's right. The best place to keep up to date about our project or learn more would probably be the Instagram for the Holy Theater or our mailing list. So the website is theholytheatre.org. That's HOLYTHEATRE.org. And the Instagram handle is the same. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been a delight to get to chat with you both about this really fascinating moment in Austen's biography. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Have a lovely day.
Thank you again to Sarah Rose Kearns and Prerna Ramachandra for joining us for this episode. You can find us on Instagram at The Thing About Austen. You can check out our website, thethingaboutausten.com, and email us at thethingaboutausten@gmail.com. And you can find our merch for the podcast on Redbubble. Go to aboutausten.redbubble.com.
Stay tuned for next episode. We will be talking about the barouche.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Agathe is a hopelessly clumsy yet charming young woman working at the legendary Shakespeare & Co. bookshop in Paris. She dreams of becoming a successful writer and finding love like in a Jane Austen novel, but she's desperately single and battling writer's block. When her best friend lands her a spot at the Jane Austen Writers' Residency in England, everything changes. Critics call Jane Austen Wrecked My Life a delectable modern rom-com and brimming with charm. Watch it home on digital today. Rated R.